It was a dreary, rainy afternoon. The kind of day where the sky feels heavy and the rain never seems to stop. The road was slick and the visibility was low thanks to a creeping fog that started to roll in as I made my way down the highway. I'd been on the road all day, my eyes tired and my mind wandering. I wasn't in any particular rush, just driving through the rain, trying to get to the next rest stop. As I rounded a bend, I saw a car pulled over on the side of the road with its hazard lights flashing. The car's shape was barely visible through the mist, but it looked like it might have been having trouble. I slowed down, wondering if I could help. It wasn't unusual to stop and lend a hand to someone in need. I pulled over to the shoulder, and as I approached, I saw a man standing next to the car. He waved at me, and I rolled down my window. "Hey, thanks for stopping," the man said, his voice muffled by the rain. "My car broke down, and I can't get it started. Could you give us a hand?" I agreed to help. The woman inside the car didn't say anything, just stared ahead, her face hidden by the fogged-up window. Something about her was off. She didn't seem scared or worried, just distant. The man explained that they were far from the nearest town and could really use a ride or some help with the car. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'm a trucker. I've helped people on the road before, and it's never been an issue. But something felt wrong this time. The man was acting too calm, and the woman just kept staring ahead. I chalked it up to my tiredness and focused on the task at hand. I stepped out of my truck, and the moment my boots hit the wet ground, the chill from the rain seemed to sink into my bones. The man handed me a small bottle, claiming it was a drink to help keep me alert. I didn't hesitate to take it, figuring it was just a kind gesture. But as soon as I drank it, my head started to spin. I felt dizzy and unsteady. My vision blurred, and I could feel my strength leaving me. Before I could react, I collapsed onto the ground, unable to move. My body felt like it was made of lead. The last thing I saw before blacking out was the man and the woman walking toward their car. They got in and drove off, leaving me there in the rain, helpless and confused. I don't know how much time passed before I finally came to. I was still lying on the wet asphalt, the rain pouring down on me, and I could feel something was missing. My wallet, my phone, gone. Everything I had was taken, and I couldn't do anything about it. I struggled to get back to my truck. My mind was foggy, and my hands shook as I tried to start the engine, but I couldn't focus enough to call anyone for help. My phone was gone, and there was no sign of the car anywhere. I was left stranded in the rain, with nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant rumble of thunder. Just as I was starting to lose hope, a figure appeared out of the mist. A man, walking slowly toward me, his face lined with age and weariness. I didn't see him approach, but suddenly he was just there, standing a few feet away. "You alright?" he asked, his voice calm but filled with concern. I nodded weakly, still trying to process what had just happened. I was robbed," I muttered. "Those people, they took everything." The man glanced at the road where the car had been, then back at me. "I saw them. Something's not right about those two. They've been in trouble for a while now," he said, his eyes narrowing. He offered to help, but I didn't know how. I was disoriented and still trying to make sense of what had just happened. "I don't know what you could do," I said, frustrated. "But I appreciate it." The man didn't insist. Instead, he just nodded and gave me a kind look. "I'll keep an eye out for you," he said. "Stay safe, friend." Without another word, he turned and started walking away, disappearing into the fog. I watched him go, feeling a strange unease. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite place. He didn't look like someone who belonged in the middle of nowhere on a rainy afternoon, offering help out of nowhere. I stayed by the truck for a little while longer, hoping that someone would pass by or I could get a signal on my phone. Eventually, I started driving again, trying to shake off the feeling that something was off. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about that man. Where did he come from? Why had he appeared at just the right moment? And what did he mean when he said he'd keep an eye out for me? It wasn't until about 5 kilometers down the road that I saw the flashing lights. As I approached, I realized it was the same car, the one I had stopped for earlier. Only now, it was wrecked, smashed into a tree. The doors were crumpled, and there was no sign of life. I pulled over to see what had happened. The bodies of the man and the woman were lying next to the car. They were dead, but the way they looked, something was wrong. It wasn't just the crash that had killed them. The wounds on their bodies were unnatural, like something had ripped them apart, savage and animalistic. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to think. But then something caught my eye. My wallet and phone were lying next to the wreckage, untouched, as if they had never been stolen. I looked back at the wrecked car, my mind racing. I don't know what happened to those two, or why their bodies looked the way they did. But one thing was clear, I wasn't alone on that road. That strange man, the one who had appeared out of nowhere, had been watching over me. And now, whenever I drive through that stretch of road, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, somewhere in the mist, waiting for the next person who needs help, or the next person who's about to be taken. It was a crisp, moonless night, and the road ahead stretched endlessly through the barren landscape. I had been driving for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, but I pushed on. I had a delivery to make, and it was a job that needed to be finished. The hum of the truck engine was soothing, almost hypnotic, as it reverberated through the cabin. I had been traveling on this stretch of highway for a while now, no other cars in sight, just the occasional flicker of a distant light on the horizon, like some far-off town that seemed to exist only in the edges of my vision. It was one of those roads that seemed to disappear into nothingness, the kind of place that felt remote. That's WH. At first, it was just a glimpse, a figure walking on the side of the road, too far out for me to make out any details. It struck me as odd, though. Who would be walking down this highway at this hour? There was no town for miles, no rest stop, just the barren stretch of asphalt that led into the darkness. As I got closer, I saw her more clearly. A woman, standing by the edge of the road, wearing a long coat. Her hair, dark and tangled, was blowing lightly in the wind. She was thin, almost fragile-looking, with pale skin that seemed to reflect the faint light from the truck's headlights. There was something about her that made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. As I passed, I slowed down. Maybe she needed help. I wasn't sure why, but I felt compelled to stop. My truck groaned to a halt, the engine sputtering as I put it in park. The woman didn't move, didn't even acknowledge me at first. I called out to her, asking if she needed a ride, but she didn't answer. I stepped out of the truck, my boots crunching against the gravel. I could feel the weight of the cold air pressing in on me, and for some reason, it felt thicker than usual, almost suffocating. I glanced back at her, and she was still standing there, staring straight ahead. There was something unnerving about her stillness, like she was waiting for something or someone. I took a cautious step toward her. "Hey, are you alright?" I asked, my voice louder this time. Still, no response. I looked around, wondering if there was anyone else out there. But the road was as empty as ever, no other cars in sight. I felt a strange sense of isolation, and for the first time in a long while, the road felt less like a place of freedom and more like a trap. I stepped closer, just a few feet away from her now. "Can I give you a ride? It's not safe out here." Finally, she turned her head, and I froze. Her eyes were wide and hollow, dark circles around them like she hadn't slept in days. But it wasn't just that. There was a strange emptiness in her gaze, something unsettling that sent a shiver down my spine. Her mouth twitched slightly as if she was about to speak, but no words came. "Please, help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The words hung in the air, and for some reason, I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind racing, trying to understand what was happening. Before I could respond, she slowly lifted her hand, pointing down the road. "It's just ahead," she said, her voice trembling. I followed her finger, but I saw nothing, just the endless stretch of highway, dark and desolate. I felt a strange pull to look at her again. Her face was pale, and her lips had begun to quiver. "Please, take me with you," she begged, her voice growing louder, almost frantic. I swallowed hard, my instincts telling me to get back in the truck and drive away, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. Something in me told me I had to help her, that this was the right thing to do. I reached out a hand, and she suddenly moved toward me, faster than I expected, her eyes wide with desperation. As she reached out for me, I felt a coldness so intense it made my skin tingle. Her touch was icy, like she had been standing in the freezing night for far too long. I pulled my hand back in shock, but before I could react, I saw something in her eyes that made my stomach drop. Her pupils were entirely black, no whites, just pure darkness. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What's happening?" I whispered. But she didn't respond. She simply stood there, staring at me with those empty, soulless eyes. The wind picked up, swirling around us in a sudden gust that made the trees nearby groan under the pressure. I realized then that I couldn't stay there any longer. Without thinking, I spun around and ran back to my truck, my heart pounding in my chest. I jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, my breath coming in short, frantic gasps. I looked out the window, but she was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw the truck in gear and sped off, my tires screeching on the gravel. I didn't look back, not even once. I couldn't afford to. But then, as I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. The road behind me was dark, empty, but then, there she was. Her face, pale and cold, staring directly at me from the mirror. Her eyes, those hollow black eyes, were fixed on mine, unblinking. I slammed the gas pedal harder, trying to get as far away from her as I could, but no matter how fast I drove, she stayed there, growing closer, her chilling stare never leaving. I could feel my pulse racing as I watched her reflection move in the mirror. She was there, always there, keeping pace with me. No matter how much I accelerated, no matter how much I swerved, she remained in the mirror, her face frozen in that cold, lifeless expression. The further I drove, the more I could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me. She was following me, not physically, but somehow, I could feel it, her spirit, her gaze, suffocating me from behind. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I dared to glance in the mirror once more. She was gone. The mirror was empty, and the road ahead was clear. I felt a brief moment of relief, but that sensation didn't last long. I couldn't shake the image of her cold, black eyes. I never stopped looking over my shoulder for the rest of the trip. And to this day, I still wonder if she's out there somewhere, waiting for the next driver who dares to stop. I'll never forget those eyes. And I'll never drive that stretch of highway again. It was a quiet, dark night when I saw her on the side of the highway. A stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, lit only by the truck's headlights, and there she was, standing in the cold, wind blowing her long hair behind her, wearing a tight, revealing dress. She was stunning, no doubt about it. Her beauty was the kind that could stop anyone in their tracks, and it made me slow down as I approached. I had been driving for hours, the loneliness of the road settling deep in my bones. I wasn't expecting anything but the usual long haul, but as I got closer to her, something about the whole situation felt off. I pulled over. The truck was grinding against the gravel as I stopped just beside her. She looked up at me, her eyes sparkling, and she smiled. It was a smile that sent a shiver down my spine, but for reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to her. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice almost betraying my nervousness. Without saying a word, she opened the passenger door and slid into the seat beside me. The scent of her perfume filled the cabin, overwhelming and intoxicating. I tried to shake the unease gnawing at me, but I couldn't help it. There was something about her, something dangerous. "Thank you for stopping," she said softly, her voice smooth and seductive. I don't know what I would have done out here alone. I glanced over at her as I pulled back onto the highway, trying to keep my focus on the road. She was looking out the window, but I could feel her eyes occasionally shifting towards me, her gaze sharp and intense. "How far are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Oh, not far," she said, her lips curling into another smile. "Just a little ways down. I have something to offer in exchange for the ride. I'm sure you could use it." I felt a rush of excitement. The way she said it, so confident, so alluring, it was like she knew exactly what she was doing. "Offer?" I asked, trying to mask my curiosity. She laughed, low and playful. "I think you'll like it," she said, and then her tone changed, darker, as she leaned closer to me. "You've helped me, so I think you deserve a reward." Before I could react, she whispered, "Let's make it fun. I like to play games." I wasn't sure what she meant at first, but I didn't question her. I wasn't about to turn down a beautiful woman offering me something more than just a ride. As we drove on, she reached into the small black briefcase at her feet and pulled out something that made my stomach turn. It was a set of ropes, thick and ominous looking. My heart raced. "I like a little extra," she said, her voice dripping with excitement. I hesitated, but the adrenaline coursing through me made it hard to think straight. "Sure," I said, almost eagerly. "Let's see where this goes." She gave me a sly grin, then instructed me to pull over on a more secluded stretch of road, deep in the woods. I did as she said, my hands shaking slightly from the anticipation of what was about to happen. I didn't know why I followed her lead. I should have been more cautious, but something in the air, the way she moved, it felt hypnotic. She instructed me to get out of the truck, and when I did, she gestured to the back of the cabin. "Lie down," she ordered, her voice suddenly cold. There was no trace of the flirtatious woman from before. She was someone else now. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I obeyed her. She tied me down, securing my arms and legs tightly to the truck's metal frame. At first, it was playful, a game, or so I thought. But then she pulled out a strange, black book from her bag, and the air around us seemed to thicken. I tried to speak, but my mouth felt dry, my words barely escaping. She began muttering words I couldn't understand, her hands moving quickly in strange patterns over the pages of the book. I realized then that this wasn't just some sick game, it was something darker. Her eyes no longer looked at me with any warmth. They were cold, empty, and her lips curled into a sinister smile. I tried to struggle, but the ropes held me fast. My mind raced as I realized what was happening. I was being bound, not just physically, but by something far more sinister. She was performing some sort of ritual. The darkness in the air grew heavy, pressing on me. I could feel a chill crawling up my spine, and every bone in my body screamed at me to break free, but I was trapped. When the ritual ended, she stood up and looked down at me. There was no trace of the seductive woman I had picked up on the highway. She was just empty. Without a word, she left the truck and disappeared into the woods. I lay there, unable to move, and when I finally freed myself, I was shaken to my core. I drove off, my head spinning, my heart pounding in my chest. But something had changed. From that night on, everything in my life began to go wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me. I started having nightmares so vivid, so terrifying that I would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, gasping for air. It didn't stop there. Family members began to die, accidents happened, people I knew started disappearing. My life turned into a waking nightmare. I couldn't escape the shadows that seemed to follow me everywhere. No matter how far I ran, the darkness that woman had brought into my life was always there, lingering, waiting. I don't know what she did to me, but I can't escape it. And I'll never forget the look in her eyes as she left, cold, empty, and full of something that shouldn't exist.